We're back in Calvin's Tracts and Letters, Volume 1. This is a 7-volume set, and we're in Chapter 3, which is Calvin's response to Bishop Sadeleto. Chapter 2 is Sadeleto's letter to the Genevans, and Geneva requested Calvin respond to that letter, and we're in the third part going through this third chapter. This is page 50 if you have the hard copy. But what arrogance, you will say, to boast that the church is with you alone, and to deny it to all the world besides. We indeed, Sadele, deny not that those over which you preside are churches of Christ, but we maintain that the Roman pontiff, with his whole herd of pseudo-bishops, who have seized upon the pastor's office, are ravening wolves, whose only study has hitherto been to scatter and trample upon the kingdom of Christ, filling it with ruin and devastation. Nor are we the first to make the complaint. With what vehemence did Bernard thunder against Eugenius and all the bishops of his own age? Yet how much more tolerable was its condition than now? For iniquity has reached its height, and now those shadowy prelates, by whom you think the church stands or perishes, and by whom we say that she has been cruelly torn and mutilated and brought to the very brink of destruction, can bear neither their vices nor the cure of them. Destroyed, the church would have been, had not God with singular goodness prevented. For in all places where the tyranny of the Roman pontiff prevails, you scarcely see as many stray and tattered vestiges as will enable you to perceive that their churches lie half buried. Nor should you think this absurd, since Paul tells you in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, that Antichrist would have his seat in no other place than in the midst of God's sanctuary. Ought not this single warning to put us on our guard against tricks and devices which may be practiced in the name of the church? But whatever the character of the men, still you say it is written, what they tell you, do. Well, no doubt if they sit in the chair of Moses, but when from the chair of verity they intoxicate the people with folly, it is written, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Matthew 16:6. It is not ours, Sadele, to rob the church of any right with the goodness of God, not only has conceded to her, but strictly guarded for her by numerous prohibitions. For his pastors are not sent forth by him to rule the church with a licentious and lawless authority, but are restricted to a certain rule of duty, which they must not exceed. So the church is ordered, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, 1 John 4:1, to see that those who are appointed over her on these terms faithfully accord with their vocation. But we must either hold the testimony of Christ of little moment, or must hold it impious to infringe in the least degree on the authority of those who he has invested with such splendid titles. Nay, it is you who are mistaken in supposing that the Lord sent tyrants over his people to rule them at pleasure, when he bestowed so much authority on those whom he sent to promulgate the gospel. Your error lies here, that is, in not reflecting that their power, before they were furnished with it, was circumscribed within certain limits. We admit, therefore, that ecclesiastical pastors are to be heard just like Christ himself, but they must be pastors who execute the office entrusted to them. And this office we maintain is not presumptuously to introduce whatever their own pleasure has rashly devised, but religiously and in good faith to deliver the oracles which they have received at the mouth of the Lord. For within these boundaries Christ confined the reverence which he required to be paid to the apostles. Nor does Peter, in 1 Peter 4, verse 11, either claim for himself or allow to others anything more than that. As often as they speak among the faithful, they speak as from the mouth of the Lord. Paul indeed justly extols in 2 Corinthians 13:10, the spiritual power with which he was invested, but with this proviso, that it was to avail only for edification, was to where no semblance of domination was not to be employed in subjugating the faith. Let your pontiff then boast, as he may, of the succession of Peter. Even should he make good his title to it, he will establish nothing more than the obedience is due to him from the Christian people, so long as he himself maintains his fidelity to Christ, and deviates not from the purity of the gospel. For the church of the faithful does not force you into any other order than that which the Lord wished you to stand, when it tests you by the rule by which all your power is defined. The order, I say, which the Lord himself instituted among the faithful, That is, that a prophet holding the place of teacher should be judged by the congregation. 1 Corinthians, that's 14, verse 29. Whoever exempts himself from this must first expunge his name from the list of prophets. And here, a very wide field for exposing your ignorance opens upon me, since in matters of religious controversy, all that you leave to the faithful is to shut their own eyes and to submit implicitly to their teachers. But since it is certain that every soul which depends not on God alone is enslaved to Satan, how miserable must they be who are imbued with such rudiments of faith. Hence I observe, Sadeleto, that you too indolent. Let's try that again. Hence I observe, Sadeleto, that you have too indolent a theology, as is almost always the case with those who have never had experience in serious struggles of conscience. For otherwise you would never place a Christian man on ground so slippery, nay, so precipitous, that he can scarcely stand a moment if even the slightest push is given to him. Give me, I say, not some unlearned man from among the pack, but the rudest clown. And if he is to belong to the flock of God, he must be prepared for that warfare which he has ordained for all the godly. An armed enemy is at hand, on the alert to engage, an enemy most skillful and unassailable by mortal strength. To resist him, with what guards must not that poor man be defended? With what weapons armed, if he is not to be instantly annihilated? Paul informs us in Ephesians 6:17 that the only sword with which he can fight is the sword of the Lord. A soul, therefore, when deprived of the word of God, is given up unarmed to the devil's destruction. Now then, will not the first machination of the enemy to be wrest from the sword from the soldier of Christ? And what the method of wresting it, but to set him a doubting whether it be the word of the Lord that he is leaning upon, or the word of man? What will you do for this unhappy being? Will you bid him look around for learned men on whom reclining he may take his rest? But the enemy will not leave him so much as a breathing time in this subterfuge. For when once he has driven him to lean upon man, he will keep urging and repeating his blows until he throws him over the precipice. Thus he must either be easily overthrown or must forsake man and look directly to God. So true it is that a Christian faith must not be founded on human testimony, not propped up by doubtful opinion, not reclined on human authority, but engraven on our hearts by the finger of the living God, so as not to be obliterated by any coloring of error. There's nothing of Christ, then, in him who does not hold the elementary principle, that is, God alone, who enlightens our minds to perceive his truth, who by the Spirit seals it on our hearts, and by his sure attestation to it confirms our conscience. This is, if I may so express it, that full and firm assurance commended by Paul, and which, as it leaves no room for doubt, so not only does it not hesitate at waver among human arguments as to which party it ought to adhere, but maintains its consistency, though the whole world should oppose. Hence arises that power of judging which we attribute to the church and wish to preserve unimpaired. For how much soever the world may fluctuate and jar with contending opinions, the faithful soul is never so destitute as not to have a straight course to salvation. I do not, however, dream of perspicacity of faith which never errs in discriminating between truth and falsehood, is never deceived, nor do I figure to myself an arrogance which looks down as from a height on the whole human race, waits for no man's judgment, and makes no distinction between learned and unlearned. On the contrary, I admit that pious and truly religious minds do not always attain to all the mysteries of God, but are sometimes blind in the clearest of matters. The Lord, doubtless, so providing in order to accustom them to modesty and submission. Again, I admit that they have such a respect for all good men, not to say the church, that they do not easily follow themselves to be separated from any man in whom they have discovered a true knowledge of Christ, so that sometimes they choose rather to suspend their judgment than to rush on slight grounds into dissent. I only contend that so long as they insist on the word of the Lord, they are never so caught as to be led away to destruction, while their conviction of the truth of the word of God is so clear and certain that it cannot be overthrown by either men or by angels. Away then with that nugatory simplicity, which you say become the rude and illiterate, of looking up and yielding to the beck of those who are more learned. For besides, that the name of faith is undeservedly bestowed on any religious persuasion, however obstinate, which rests anywhere but in God, who can give such a name to some, I know not what, wavering opinion, which is not only easily wrested from them by the arts of the devil, but fluctuates of its own accord with the temper of the times, and of which no other end can be hoped for than that it will at length vanish away. As to your assertion, that our only aim is in shaking off this tyrannical yoke was to set upon ourselves free from unbridled licentiousness after, so help us, casting away all thoughts of future life, let judgment be given after comparing our conduct with yours. I love this argument. I'm going to read that again. As to your assertion that our only aim in shaking off this tyrannical yoke was to set ourselves free from unbridled licentiousness after, so help us, casting away all thoughts of future life, let judgment be given after comparing our conduct with yours. We abound indeed in numerous faults. Too often we sin and fall. Still, though truth would, modestly will not, permit me to boast how far we excel you in every respect, unless perchance you are to accept Rome, that famous abode of sanctity, which having burst asunder the cords of pure discipline, and trod in all honor under foot, has so overflowed with all kinds of iniquity, that scarcely anything so abominable has ever been before. We behold, forsooth, to expose our heads to so many perils and dangers that we might not, after her example, be placed under too severe constraint. But we have not the least objection that the discipline which was sanctioned by ancient canons should be enforced in the present day and be carefully and faithfully observed. Nay, we have always protested that the miserable condition into which the church had fallen was owing to nothing more than its enervation by luxury and indulgence. For the body of the church to cohere well must be bound together by discipline, as with sinews. But how, on your part, is discipline either observed or desired? Where are those ancient canons with which, like a bridle, bishops and presbyters were kept to their duty? How are your bishops elected? After what trial? What examination, what care, what caution? How are they inducted to their office? With what order? What solemnity? They merely take an official oath that they will perform the pastoral office, and this is apparently for no other end than that they may add perjury to their own iniquities. Since then, in seizing upon ecclesiastical offices, they seem to enter upon an authority restricted by no law. They think themselves free to do as they please, and hence it is among the pirates and robbers there is apparently more justice and regular government, more effect given to the law than by all your order. But since towards the end a person has been introduced to plead our cause, and you have cited us as defenders to the tribunal of God, I have no hesitation in calling upon you there to meet me. For such is our consciousness of the truth of our doctrine, that it has due dread of the heavenly judge, from whom we doubt not that it proceeded. But it dwells not on those frivolities with which it has pleased you to amuse yourself. Excuse me. Certainly very much out of place. For what more unseasonable than after you had come into the presence of God to set about devising I know not what follies and framing for us an absurd defense which must instantly fail. In pious minds, as often as the day is suggested, the impression made is too solemn to leave them at leisure, so to distort themselves. Therefore, frivolity aside, let us think of that day, in expectation of which the minds of men ought ever to be on the watch. And let us remember that while it is day to be desired by the faithful, it is also one at which the ungodly and profane, and those who are despisers of God, may well be alarmed. Let us turn our ears to the clang of the trumpet, which even the ashes of the dead shall hear in their tombs. Let us direct our thoughts and minds to that judge who, by mere brightness of his countenance, will disclose whatever lurks in darkness, lay open all the secrets of, the human heart, and crush all the wicked by the mere breath of his mouth. Consider now what serious answer you are to make for yourself and your party. Our cause is supported by the truth of God. We'll be at no loss for a complete defense. I speak not of our persons whose safety will be found not in defense, but in humble confession and suppliant deprecation. But insofar as our ministry is concerned, there's none of us who will not be able to thus speak. O Lord, I have indeed experienced how difficult and grievous it was to bear the invidious accusations with which I was harassed on earth, but with the same confidence with which I was appealed to thy tribunal, I now appear before thee, because I know that in thy judgment truth always reigns. That truth, by whose assurance supported I first ventured to attempt, with whose assistance provided I was able to accomplish whatever I had to achieve in thy church. They charged me with two of the worst crimes, heresy and schism. And the heresy was that I dared to protest against dogmas which they received. But what could I have done? I heard from thy mouth that there was no other light of truth which could direct our souls into the way of life than that which was kindled by thy word. I heard that whatever human minds of themselves conceive concerning thy majesty, the worship of thy deity, and the mysteries of thy religion was vanity. I heard that their introducing into the church instead of thy word, doctrines sprung from the human brain, was sacrilegious presumption. But when I turned my eyes towards men, I saw very different principles prevailing. Those who were regarded as the leaders of faith neither understood thy word nor greatly cared for it. They only drove unhappy people to and fro with strange doctrines and deluded them with I know not what follies. Among the people themselves, the highest veneration paid to thy word was to revere it at a distance, as a thing inaccessible, and abstain from all investigation of it. Owing to this supine state of the pastors and the stupidity of the people, every place was filled with pernicious errors, falsehoods, and superstitions. They indeed called thee the only God, but it was while transferring to others the glory which thou hast claimed for thy majesty. They figured and had for themselves as many gods as they had saints, whom they chose to worship. Thy Christ was indeed worshipped as God, and retained the name of Savior, but where he ought to have been honored, he was left almost without honor. For spoiled of his own virtue, he passed unnoticed among the crowd of saints like one of the meanest of them. There was none who duly considered that one sacrifice which he offered on the cross, and by which he reconciled us to thyself, none who ever dreamed of thinking of eternal priesthood and the intercession depending upon it, none who trusted in his righteousness only. None who trusted in his righteousness only. That confident hope of salvation, which is both enjoyed by the word and founded upon it, had almost vanished. Nay, it was received as a kind of oracle, that it was foolish arrogance, and as they termed it, presumption, for anyone trusting to thy goodness and the righteousness of thy Son to entertain a sure and unfaltering hope of salvation. Not a few profane opinions plucked up by the roots, the first principles of the doctrine which thou hast delivered to us in thy word, the true meaning of baptism and the Lord's Supper, also were corrupted by numerous falsehoods. And then when all, with no small insult to the mercy, put confidence in good works, when by good works they strove to merit thy favor, to procure justification, to expiate their sins, and make satisfaction to thee, each of these things obliterating and making void the virtue of Christ's cross, they were yet altogether ignorant wherein good works consisted. For just as if they were not at all instructed in righteousness by the law, they had fabricated for themselves many useless frivolities as a means of procuring thy favor, and on these they so plumed themselves that in comparison of them they almost contemned the standard of true righteousness which thy law recommended, to such a degree that human desires, after usurping the ascendancy, derogated, if not from the belief, at least from the authority of thy precepts therein contained, that I might perceive these things, thou, O Lord, didst shine upon me with the brightness of thy Spirit, that I might comprehend how impious and nauseous they were. Thou didst bear before me the torch of thy word, that I might abominate them as they deserved. Thou didst stimulate my soul, but in rendering an account of my doctrine, thou seest what my own conscience declares, that it was not my intention to stray beyond those limits which I saw had been fixed by all thy servants. Whatever I felt assured that I had learned from my youth, I desire to dispense faithfully to the church. Assuredly, the thing at which I chiefly aimed, and for which I most diligently labored, was that the glory of thy goodness and justice, after dispersing the midst by which it was formerly obscured, might shine forth conspicuous rather, that the virtue and the blessings of thy Christ, all glosses being wiped away, might be fully displayed. For I thought it impious to leave in obscurity things which were born to ponder and meditate. Nor did I think that truths, whose magnitude no language can express, were to be maliciously or falsely declared. I hesitated not to dwell at greater length on topics on which the salvation of my hearers depended, for the oracle could never deceive which declares, John 17:3, this is eternal life, to know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. As to the charge of forsaking the church which they were wont to bring against me, there is nothing of which my conscience accuses me, unless indeed he is to be considered a deserter who, seeing the soldiers routed and scattered and abandoning the ranks, raises the leader's standard and recalls them to their posts. For thus, O Lord, were all thy servants dispersed, so that they could not, by any possibility, hear the command, but had almost forgotten their leader and their service and their military oath, in order to bring them together when thus scattered. I raise not a foreign standard, but that noble banner of thine whom we must follow, if we would be classed among thy people. Then I was assailed by those who, when they ought to have kept others in their ranks, had led them astray, and when I determined not to desist, opposed me with violence. On this grievous tumults arose, and the contest blazed and issued in disruption. With whom the blame rests, it is for thee, O Lord, to decide. Always both by word and deed have I protested how eager I was for unity. Mine, however, was a unity of the church which should begin with thee and end in thee. For as oft as thou didst recommend to us peace and concord, thou at the same time didst show that thou were the only bond for preserving it. You were the only bond for preserving it. But if I desired to be at peace with those who boast of being the heads of the church and pillars of the faith, I behoved to purchase it with the denial of thy truth. I thought that anything was to be endured sooner than stoop to such a nefarious paction. For thy anointed himself hath declared that though heaven and earth should be confounded, yet thy word must endure forever. Matthew 24:35. Nor did I think that I dissented from thy church, because I was at war with those leaders, for thou hast forewarned me, both by the Son and by the apostles, that that place would be occupied by persons to whom I ought by no means to consent. Christ had predicted not of strangers, but of men who should give themselves out for pastors, that they would be ravenous wolves and false prophets, and had at the same time cautioned to beware of them. Where Christ ordered me to beware, was I to lend my aid? And the apostles declared that there would be no enemies of thy church more pestilential than those from within, who should conceal themselves under the title of pastors. Matthew 7:15, Acts 20:29, 2 Peter 2:1, 1 John 2:18. Why should I have hesitated to separate myself from persons whom they forewarned me to hold as enemies? I had before my eyes the examples of thy prophets, who I saw had a similar contest with the priests and prophets of their day, though these were undoubtedly the rulers of the church among the Israelitish people. But thy prophets are not regarded as schismatics, because when they wished to revive religion, which had fallen into decay, they desisted not, although opposed with the utmost violence. They still remained in the unity of the church, though they were doomed to perdition by wicked priests and deemed unworthy of a place among men, not to say saints. Confirmed by their example, I too persisted. Though denounced as a deserter of the church and threatened, I was in no respect deterred or induced to proceed less firmly and boldly in opposing those who, in the character of pastors, wasted thy church with a more than impious tyranny. My conscience told me how strong the zeal was with which I burned for the unity of thy church, provided thy truth were made the bond of concord. As the commotion which followed were not excited by me, so there's no ground for imputing them to me. Thou, O Lord, knowest, and that the fact itself has testified to men that the only thing I was asked was that all controversy should be decided by thy word, that thus both parties might unite with one mind to establish thy kingdom. And I declined not to restore peace to the church at the expense of my head, if I were found to have been unnecessarily the cause of tumult. But what did our opponents? Did they not instantly, and like madmen, fly to fires, swords, and gibbets? Did they not decide that their only security was in arms and cruelty? Did they not instigate all ranks to the same fury? Did they not spurn at all methods of pacification? To this it is owing that a matter which might at one time have been settled amicably has blazed into such a contest. But although amidst the great confusion the judgments of men were various, I am freed from all fear, now that we stand at thy tribunal, where equity combined with truth cannot but decide in favor of innocence. He then proceeds, we'll pause there for today, but he then proceeds in readdressing Sadeleto, and some of Sadeleto's practices that illustrate the point he had previously made. You're going to accuse us as trying to promote licentiousness by shaking off the shackles of tyranny, then your own lifestyles should certainly support that, and they don't. So this is volume 1, Calvin, his letter to Sadeleto.